Hello there. Hope everyone is having a happy and safe week. So you guys did a great job on the discussion board. This is I'm referring specifically to this is the Frankenfish article on scientism. You guys picked up on a lot of the themes and had a good reading of it. I don't really feel like I have anything beyond my setup from last week and what you guys have on those discussion boards to add. If you have not read through your colleague's post, I'd greatly recommend it. So it's there's some good analysis going on there. So this week we're going to talk about collective behavior and social movements. So these are both perspectives or areas of sociology which is interested in thinking about people as a collective. Thinking about people in terms of groups. And in particular, when people act together in unison with one another. So this kind of you think about like moments when groups of people act together, right? That's kind of the central focus of both collective behavior and social movements. They are usually topics that butt heads a little bit. First of all, collective behavior is something that initially has been around for a long time in sociology, but has sort of like waned in people's acceptance of the philosophy of collective behavior, starting in the 1970s. So collective behavior but it's interesting because it still sticks around. Collective behavior was in my intro textbook when I was your age. It's in the intro textbook now. It's in almost every intro textbook I've ever seen, despite the fact that nobody's really done work in collective behavior in almost 50 years. Collective behavior is all about the emergence of a group in a moment. So if we think about the archetype of collective behavior, it's like a riot. All of a sudden you have groups of people together and their energy sort of feeds out of each other and they're transformed into something else, something beyond the individual. The founder of collective behavior theory, Gustave Le Bon, in the late 1800s, would call the crowd. So it's sort of this group mind, this mob mentality, right, that all of a sudden gets constructed when you get large groups of people together. And generally this is seen as sort of an unorchestrated event. People are seen as not being capable of controlling their actions, and it's seen as largely illogical. So crowds are sort of like basically when people lose their abilities to think through their actions and their reasons simply because of some sort of collective energy, or what Durkheim would call collective effervescence, right? This feeling of growing out of being in large groups. You know, it is sort of the sentiment, if you think about, sometimes you'll hear people say that, individuals can be smart, but people are stupid, right? That's kind of the same idea, right? You get too many people together, they sort of lose their ability to reason, they don't think, especially if it becomes this emotionally charged moment. So that's kind of the idea. The reason why they become doubted is, so even if we take that archetype of a riot, it's rarely, that's sort of a simplistic explanation. In some ways it's a non-explanation for what's going on. People go to a riot and they often do so with purpose, right? They do so with reasons. The reasons could be as simple as looting, right? Stealing stuff from places where the riot's occurring, or it could be things like dissatisfaction, right, with the way that a specific group of people or a specific community, the life there, right? So if you think about and I think a lot of the doubts surrounding collective behavior theory come around things like race riots. In the 70s and 80s and on to today even, right? Where quite literally the riot occurs as something that is a statement about an event, right? Or in particular you see a lot of things like the cops will, you know, gun down some unarmed person, and then there'll be a riot in a particular neighborhood, right? Why that it's hard to say that that riot is just sort of a collective energy and that it's irrational. And it's quite literally a political act. It's not unorchestrated. There often are people who specifically orchestrate the riot, right? People who have a vested interest in creating that. So like in a lot of ways, like the collective behavior is now largely seen by sociologists as sort of an anti-change narrative, right? It sort of silences to some degree like that collective action is sort of like the power of a group that has no power. It is a weapon of the weak. Yeah, so that's kind of like a lot of the reasons why collective behavior is taken with a grain of salt now. Instead, increasingly people are interested more in talking about the social movement end of things. So social movement is sort of like the antithesis of collective behavior. You know, it instead is focusing on the ways in which groups of people, right, within democracies, in particular within systems of government where there's a public sphere, where the idea is that you know, representative government should listen to people. Social movements can essentially make sure that they're being heard, right? And this is like we all know. So if we think of the archetype of social movements, it's more something like protest. Right, rather than riot, even though I think a lot of social movements people would argue that riots are almost always protests in one way or another. So this focus on within democracies, challenging existing governments from within, right, via mass action. There's a couple different brands of social movement literature. So one of which is going to be something called resource mobilization theory. A lot of times sociology has a relationship with political movements, meaning that individual sociologists are often very much so involved in political movements. So if you think about like a lot of the things that we've been talking about this semester, you know, forms of inequality, race, gender inequality. These are things that within often social movements are attempting to change, right? So sometimes that affinity leads within sociology to there to be a brand of social movement thought that is essentially like, how do you do it, right? It's like sort of a how-to guide for social movements, and that's really kind of what resource mobilization, a lot of American sociology on social movements in particular focuses on this this sort of like how-to model. It has this underlying assumption that you know, the government, the economy has things within it that need to change, and that it's important to have these sort of oppositional standpoints, right? That by opposing the existing order, right, there's something positive coming out of that. So they want to say, what is it that makes us successfully do that, right? Because economic and political change happen all the time. Sometimes it happens in ways that are positive, sometimes it happens in ways that are negative. But if you want to enact change, how do you go about doing it? What works? What doesn't? What are the things that get in the way? What are the things that we can take advantage of, right? And that's kind of like the idea is like the reason why it's called resource mobilization theory often is it's this idea of like you know, people are a resource, different groups, right, are resources. How do you utilize those resources in an effective manner? It's almost a little economistic, right? How is it that you have a successful movement? The other literature the other major literature is something sometimes called new social movements theory, and new social movements theory not only assumes that we should change the existing political and economic order, but it also assumes that the ways in which we go about changing them, right, often fail. This literature is is in some ways kind of like older than the new social movements theory. It's built off of like a lot of the Marxist literature. Even if we can go all the way back to Marx himself. Marx wrote this very famous book called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is just he's a French king. So Louis Bonaparte essentially sets himself up as king. He's I think the nephew of the famous Bonaparte. I'm blanking on the name. I miss you guys being in the room. You could holler Napoleon. Thank you, Napoleon Bonaparte. And so this is after France becomes democratic. There's this sort of anti-democracy movement. And so Marx analyzes, what is it that makes this possible, right? What makes it something that what makes people give up their rights? This becomes sort of an archetype of how we talk about later on things like fascism. Fascism is a sort of anti-democratic movement. It's a populist movement, much like the movement for Louis Bonaparte in France in the 19th century. Just like a lot of the authoritarian movements that are happening right now, more and more of the world is authoritarian over the last 15 years, 10 years. Something I never thought I would see again in my lifetime, but there it is. So it's a question of like, how does something like that happen? In particular, Marx is interested in the way in which we use symbols. And you see this a lot in a lot of Marxist literature. How is it that symbols are used in a way to sort of enact people's emotions, right? Get people to feel something specific, and then how is that mobilizing them to action? So in a lot of ways, we could view this literature as sort of the opposite of resource mobilization theory. Resource mobilization theory is sort of like, how is it that you mobilize people, right? How is it that you convince them to become political actors? In this sort of like other literature, this sort of literature growing out of Marxism in this case, what it wants to be very wary of it. And Marx would say that if you had to manipulate people into joining a political movement, it's probably a movement that's not in their own interest. So there's a lot of fear surrounding like this idea of like people being manipulated, right? And then inside of that literature, you also have this idea of what's called co-option. So even a movement that can start out as something really positive, start out trying to achieve the goals that it's set for itself, often other actors, particularly wealthy or powerful actors, can then co-opt that movement and use it for something different. So that's called movement co-option, right? So what we're looking at is we have sort of a how-to manual on one end that assumes that by and large, right, political protest action works. It's just getting the pieces right. And on the other end, we have in social movement theory a lot of theories that are going to instead say, no, we need to change how we protest, right? We need to change how we challenge government. Or otherwise, we're just going to sort of recreate this whole system. So I mentioned new social movement theory. New social movement theory is one of the versions of this that are newer. In particular, there's a famous sociologist by the name of Jürgen Habermas. And Jürgen Habermas is going to claim that what's referred to in new social movement theory as the public sphere is broken. So the public sphere is basically this space in which, right, people protest, or you can think about things like the news media, right? All these sort of ways in which you can get the word out about your cause, right? And originally the founders of our country had this idea of like, well, within democracy we can create these sort of public discourses and come to solutions, and that these solutions can better our world. Habermas loves the ideal of it, but he wants to claim that it didn't work that way. That the public sphere got dominated by economic and political actors. So that as institutions, right, the rest of us essentially have gotten sort of wedged out of politics. So that in a lot of ways we could view the entire political system as the co-option of this public sphere. So he refers to this co-option as the system, the very genuine ability of people to come to reasonable solutions through discourse as the life world. So the system has concretized or colonized the life world. So Habermas would want to say, how can we, right, come up with new ways of speaking and talking and discoursing that removes politics and economics from it. You guys may or may not remember the Occupy movement in New York. It was all over the country, but New York was the largest site of it. These are the people who wore the Guy Fawkes masks, the masks that is in a comic book movie at the time. But you can search Guy Fawkes mask and you'll see what they look like. So the Occupy movement, the way they made decisions was this sort of like radical democracy where like there were all these rules that governed how you could or could not address things, and ways of avoiding people being able to dominate discussions on the basis of their gender or their race or their ethnicity. So like they created this their attempt to create what Habermas would call a free speech situation. Whether or not they do that in line with Habermas's theory isn't necessarily the question, but the idea is that that's the kind of thing that New Social Movement theory is really interested in. How is it that we reconstruct the way we address problems in politics and economics, which is once again very different from the American resource mobilization theory, which assumes that we don't have to. So for this week, your article is on a specific social movement. It's an empirical article on the permaculture movement in India. So yeah, think about the ideas that I've kind of brought up here or that are in the chapter, right? Read the article and provide us a reading. How does this fit into these bigger discussions of social movements and how they work? Okay, have a great week. As always, feel free to contact me anytime. I know a lot of people have been in contact with me about the stresses in their lives and how they're getting in the way of their work or whatever. I greatly appreciate that. Don't be afraid to reach out. We are running on the home stretch. We have one more week of discussion boards. So that is coming up very soon. I'm going to look at my syllabus here for a second just to make sure we no other announcements I should have. Okay. So yeah, one more week. We're gonna do the sound of stigmatization, and then the only thing left is your final, and the final has been posted. So it's up on Blackboard. You can start working on that at any time. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you and have a good week. Bye.